when God shows up in the flesh of Jesus, he doesn't show up in a poor family and in weakness and in vulnerability in order to like just assume that momentarily to be a servant to us. No, it's actually his humility, his poverty, his weakness that are revelations not only of what it means to be human, but what God is like in eternity.
Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. I am Dr. Tom Rundell, your curator of conversations, and today I have one of my favorite voices on my Facebook feed, Father Kenny, and there is a desire on my end to make a t-shirt that says Father Kenny is my homeboy, and you'll see why in this conversation. Father Kenny, a little bit about him. He is a writer, soon to be author. He is a pastor at Holy Redeemer in Rochester Hills, Michigan. And that is a part of the charismatic Episcopalian tradition, which is a thing. And for reals, I went to an Easter service there. One of those years I was in between pastorates, and it was so beautiful. It was liturgical and vibrant and music, and they still had the processions of crosses and incense, and I've never experienced anything like that before, and he gave me an imagination for how to be a pastor of a church in this area that I'm in, and he has really contributed to my life with his voice, and I'm just so happy that I get to share his voice with all of you, and we contemplate the character of Christ here. And he does that in real time with us. So I will let you loose on this conversation with Father Kenneth Tanner. Can I call you Father Kenny?
Sure.
Because that's how I got to know it. Because I wanted to make a t-shirt that said Father Kenny is my homeboy. And I wanted to put it next to my Thomas Merton is my homeboy t-shirt. So
you probably know the story, but in growing up in the South, they put your first and last name together, and these kind of, my name is Kenneth Wayne, and so they would call me Kenny Wayne. Or in the South, it really kind of flows into what's like Kenna Wayne is what it sounds like.
There's kind of a twang in there.
Drop the TH and, Kenna Wayne.
Kenna Wayne. You'll be Father Kenna Wayne.
Yeah. My uncle showed up at something I was at in Orlando years ago. And he and other people were in the lobby, of the hotel. And he says to me, he goes, Kenaway, you can go all over the world, speak in front of hundreds of people, write articles, have your name in magazines and newspapers, but you'll always be Kenaway to me.
I love that story. Well, I mean, that's a beautiful introduction right there. Father Kenny, welcome to the show. I am so happy to have you here.
Tom.
So, gosh, we've kind of known each other from a distance for a while.
I was trying to think when the last time you and your wife and son were at Redeemer. It feels like it was before the pandemic.
It was, it was 2014 or 15. We showed up for an Easter Sunday. And I remember going up to get communion, and you were giving me a look, because we were connected on Facebook for a while. And I went forward to get communion, and you're looking at me like, I think I know this guy.
Yeah, probably.
And you served me communion. And then you said something, and it didn't hit me till later, but you said, God will bring you through anything, my son. And it I was more like worried, like, okay, I got to learn how to do communion at this church. It's different than how I do it. And so I'm trying to get through the motions, and you said that, and it stuck in the subconscious of my brain until I got done and I sat back down. My anxiety went down. I'm like, okay, I did it. And I'm like, wait, what did you just say?
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things. And, I was dealing with some medical issues with my disabled son, and my dad had just died, and it was just a really hard time. And yeah, you just gave me a funny look and told me that thing, and it was just like it like stuck to my soul somewhere.
Yeah. I'm sure I didn't know about anything you were going through, but I do occasionally get these kinds of impressions
Mm-hmm.
or feelings that I need to say because I mean the words are the body of Christ. I mean
Yeah.
that's very simple, just
Yeah.
the body of Christ, and but occasionally I will say things like I there's something that I say rather frequently. I'll say the words of Augustine, behold what you are, become what you receive.
Mm.
So it's a way of saying what the body of Christ is. What the bread is the body of Christ, and then you're going to become the body of Christ by receiving this. But occasionally there'll be some sense of saying something more to someone, and it's rare. So I'm glad to have said that, and I'm glad that it meant something to you where you were at, in your life at the time. It's
Yeah.
good.
And I was reading a lot of your things online at the time. You're posting a lot of your writings about some things I do want to get talking to. And I was in the midst of a deep reframing work because, like, my cognitive theology that I put inside of my head, through my degrees and training and seminary, was just not matching up to what I was experiencing in life. We have these like pop inspirational cliches that,
Yeah.
they pass for theology, but they don't hold water when life is consistently difficult. Dealing with chronic illness, raising a disabled child, losing my dad.
Yeah.
And it was just like, you became like this voice calling in the wilderness. And you were showing me like this uncharted pathway out of my confusion in that moment. And I remember the first message I sent to you on Facebook, I just said, your theology is healing me. Thank you. And that was the first exchange we ever had.
I'm
But
grateful.
the thing is, like, you didn't hand me answers. Like, you handed me mystery. And I guess I can say thank you for that. You handed me this mystery, and it wasn't just a pat answer or a different cliche or, even a new way of thinking. You just handed me the mystery that is Christ. And so thank you for doing that for me in a really difficult season.
I'm grateful. Thank you. I'm grateful for that. I do, in mystery, not in the sense of, like a detective novel, something we've got to figure out the answers for. I do think mystery is something that we get glimpses of, and we get pieces of, and we get impressions of, and we get visions of, and it is something so great that while we can put some words to it, we can't hold it or um, write a sentence and say that's it, because it's beautiful and good and true, but it doesn't, it can't be contained, by our descriptions of it or our there's many, many, many beautiful mysteries in the story of Jesus, but and so it's not like we can't say things. We can say some things about it, and it's good for us to say things about it. And there are things that the whole church has agreed to say about it. The story that belongs to everyone, to all humans, the human God, but they are it is they're mysteries in that sense. not in the sense that if we could just do the work, we'll figure out the answer, to who did what to whom, but they're mysteries in the sense that we can poke at and try to speak of, but it's greater, it's greater than any formulation or words or sentences, because there's a glory, there that is not finally describable or circumscribable or containable. And that's what draws out our awe, draws out our worship. So, yeah, I'm grateful that was true, that what I was trying to do and describing some things that I'd seen was in some way healing to you. It means a lot. So thank you.
You were writing very distinct things about the incarnation. And so you were handing me the mystery, and you're still using, phrases and terminology and vocabulary to like encompass that mystery. But at the same time, like the way that you write, the way that you speak, you're not saying, this box contains everything. You're saying there's a gift in here, and the gift is bigger than this box. Yeah. And I don't know how you do it, because you say very precise things about incarnation, about Christ, and at the same time, you leave the vastness of it there within the definitions. And that's a gift that you have in your writing, that you can really hone in and say this is true, and yet leave enough room for the vastness that this isn't the containment of the entire truth in there.
I hope that I'm able to, I'm grateful for that witness, and I'm grateful for that description. I hope that, and I have no idea, but I hope that it's something that I continue to do, because it's what I want to be doing. I want us, I'm astonished by the person of Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I try to describe my astonishment with him. And there's some of the backstory on that. And, I was thrust into this, life of being a pastor, and I felt called to it, but it was a long journey for me. I did other things in life, and then I was doing this and immediately thrust into these circumstances of human suffering and of death and of, the realities of the things that really are hard, as you were talking about earlier. And I didn't know it, but I was dealing with anxiety. And I mean, it goes back to when I was only, 5, my father was killed in Vietnam. Mm. And I think it was not having really, faced that death, but I'm all of a sudden being confronted with violent death. A young man was murdered just outside the parish, and accidental death of a young man on a highway on the way to one of the parishes in the desert. And seeing and experiencing people's pain and suffering around those losses. And one day my heart just started, went off racing, and I was in the hospital, and they got it back under control. But then weeks later, I'm sitting in the office with this physician. He's Croatian. He's, probably about our age at that time. This is, 30 years ago. And he's sitting across from me, and he's like rubbing his hands together, and he's doing this for a minute. I was kind of getting, what is this guy going to say anything? He's looking at his hands, rubbing his hands together, and finally he looked up at me and he was like, "Father Tanner, why are you so anxious? You work for God, and first of all, that was arresting, but, he asked me, if I prayed the Psalms, and I'm thinking, this guy's an internist. I thought I was here to talk about my blood pressure or whatever. And I said, no, I don't. Which it's funny because I was on a multi-staff church, and we had many services every day of prayer, morning and evening prayer, Eucharist, all these things. So I was praying the Psalms all the time, but I took him to mean, do I sit down personally and, pray the Psalms? Anyway, he went from that to talking about meditating on the person of Jesus, and I just said, no. So basically, along with his prescription and along with whatever he was telling me, but he gave me that. He said, you need to contemplate the person of Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And, anxiety is a complicated thing, and people have anxiety for all sorts of reasons. And, counseling is important, and sometimes people need medicine or whatever. But part of my cure was to ponder the person of Jesus. I started doing that in a way that I hadn't done before. And over time, like a decade, it wasn't something that happened overnight. I did find myself less nervous in situations of things that would make me anxious, made me less anxious than they did in the past. That has faded. And there's other things to say about all. Like I say, it's a very complicated situation, but it comes from, being thrust into ministry and then feeling anxiety from very severe, there are times when I still go into these, deep situations of trauma, and, families, 3 of their children are struck by a boat, and none of them are expected to live. And by mercy, some inexplicable, one of the children survives. And then being at the Oxford, shooting incident with those families and notifying those families of the death of their children. And you go into these very difficult spaces, and it takes time to recover from that. But contemplation of the person of Jesus has helped. And it's where, if we're just talking about an origin, it's where the meditations that I do write and the things that I do preach, such as they are, and I'm grateful that they've been helpful to you. They come from that place.
So you've really touched the heart of humanity, because humanity's it's not just about the great glory moments, but you've gone to the depths with families and with individuals and seen people to the other side. And if you're thrust into those things, you don't know how to be in those moments. And a lot of the anxiety, I think, being a pastor, I'm around a lot of that as well, doing a lot of funerals. You're thrust into these situations of grief, and you have to be there for the family, and not knowing how to be in those moments. Man, it is a source of anxiety. What do they need me to say? What should I be doing? Is this a time to be silent? Is this a time to offer advice? Is this a time to give a hug? A lot of the anxiety, I think, maybe it can come from early on when you don't have the experience. I don't know what is expected of me in this realm. And It's a very serious realm. These are, I remember the very first difficult situation I was thrust in as a young pastor was an accidental shooting of a 9-year-old boy, and being in the hospital with the family when they heard the words, there's no hope, we need to unplug. And I was in the room, and I was like an associate pastor when I was there with my boss, who was also my friend and mentor. And we were driving home after that moment, and I was just so surprised at how unshaken he was and how shaken I was. And, here he is seasoned in the ministry, and I'm brand new to this. And I just said, how are you not shaken by this moment? I'm deeply shaken. And I really don't remember quite what he said, but it was something along the lines of, I've done this with people, for people. I know how to be with them in those scenarios. And so, while he has to process them too in his own way, it's familiar ground to him. It's unfamiliar ground to me. And that was, that was a rough day. Oh, for sure.
It is. They are. And some of it you be taught, right?
Yes.
Don't say this.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you do, don't say this,
Mm-hmm.
and in a situation where less is more, and where bodily presence is more important than what you say.
Yeah.
But what you say is important, and don't say these things, but it is something that, just in terms of that type of ministry, there isn't any way to really, again, it's not something you can put in a box. I mean, you have to respond. As Gregory the Great would say, that every human being is a particular cosmos and universe, and how they are going to process this moment, is different than how someone else is going to. And I mean, the main thing is to be there and to be in solidarity with them.
Mm-hmm.
Put yourself in that same place with them. Say some prayers, hold some hands, embrace, stay with, through that, and stay connected, especially if they're, people who's, you're charged with the care of their soul.
Yeah.
So it's, but it's not easy,
That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, here you are, you're on my screen today, and you are this like bearded, wise sage. You look like almost Gandalf if he was an Orthodox
bearded,
monk.
yes, wisdom. I don't know.
You're getting there.
Interview some of my family members, interview people closer to me. But anyway, go ahead.
But there was a time when you were a child. There was a time when you were an aspiring young man, a new husband, a father, just starting out, a pastor just starting out. What is the soil that your life has grown from? What has brought you here today?
Yeah. Again, there was that very early loss, and you were touching on it so beautifully a minute ago. It's like, those soldiers show up at the front door and say, that my father had been killed, and what happened to my mother in that moment. How disintegrating those words were to her as a human being, and trying to hold, get her back together, wanting it to end, wanting her not to suffer in that way. And that took some years to work out. And she sent me to a counselor, not knowing exactly what was happening with me, but I struggled, with that. And I'm grateful that she had the wisdom to send me to someone who I had, talked through some of it with. But that thrust me into greater communion with my father's mother, who was a second generation Pentecostal woman, and her husband. And I spent lots of weekends with them growing up, until my mother, about 5 years later, remarried a man who was a minister in the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, Pentecostal denomination. But I spent a lot of weekends with her. And, this was a woman, her husband was disabled, and she worked in a factory. And so she, these people came out of the Depression as newly fed children, but they were just used to, major hardship, and she could do everything. I mean, she worked in the factory, but she also handled all the domestic affairs. But she was someone who, and they were people, and the community, the church that we all went to, was full of these sort of older saints Pentecostals who were, we sang, 19th century blood hymns and, spoke in tongues and but loved Jesus, this intimate connection, their own personal intimate connection with Jesus, but even together as a community, Jesus was the center, An experience of Jesus by the Spirit was at the center of who they were, and reading the scriptures or being with the poor or whatever it was. And lots of exuberance and lots of joy, and lots of tears. And so that's the soil, and I think, as my parents, my mother and my stepfather, took us into more charismatic sort of churches in my teens and in my young adulthood. And that's not the same thing as, that Southern, early Pentecostalism, which has, its beauties, and it has its, it has its things where you're sort of trying to be holy and avoid things of the world, and it gets, the eschatology is kind of strange, raptures and all these kind of things, but on the whole, beautiful experience. And the charismatic thing was beautiful too in its beginnings, the Spirit of God, and all the Protestant churches, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, but then that also became weird in some of its movements. And I ended up at Oral Roberts, and with my love of the Pentecostal formation of my grandparents, but also suspect of this whole thing where being a Christian was about sort of overcoming the world, and to be someone who was absent hardship was evidence that you were somehow had made it in life, is to escape all the normal difficulties of life either. And if you weren't doing that, you were either sort of disobedient in some way to God, or you weren't having enough faith, so your life isn't working out, and it's strange things like this. And I get to Oral Roberts, and this event happens, the shuttle Challenger explodes, and it's on a it's on a weekday, and we've all seen this, and we get to this chapel service, which we had several times a week. You had to go to these chapel services, and the pastor of the community gets up in there and says, hey, this horrible things happened, and we've got to it's difficult, but we're going to leave that outside of the walls of the sanctuary. We're here just to praise Jesus. And they went into a hootenanny of praise, and sign me up for worship songs and joyous music and so forth and so on. But that morning I just was like, this is inappropriate to, like, this feeling, that this experience we've all had, this tragedy. Why are we pushing that out? And that same event, that same service, a man who was a member of the theological faculty, these people were not normally the teachers in these contexts, but that morning he was. And he got up after the hootenanny and said, I want to talk to you this morning about how, my wife died of cancer last year, and I want to talk to you about how we walked through that experience, beginning to understand that each of us in different ways, that Christ was suffering with us, and that we were entering into the sufferings of Christ, each in our own ways, and this reciprocity of suffering. And I was like, whoa, what's going on there? Now that's something that makes, that I can hold on to, I can get a hold of. That sounds human, that sounds real. And so just within a few weeks, I ran into, via Tom Howard, I ran into Irenaeus talking about how God had become human, in order to not to destroy the world, but to reclaim his good creation, the creation that is good, that he made good, and that he desires to exist, which was very different than some of what I've been taught before.
Yeah.
And that he becomes human, in order to rescue not just me, but all humans from death. And that he's interested in my, and all of us thriving and in this world thriving. And that was just different than what I'd heard. There's a bit of a Gnostic streak in some of, American Christianity, Pentecostal, charismatic Christianity, and some of it, where, we escape the world and the world is destroyed, and we go off somewhere to the spiritual place and plane. And I guess there was something about it just didn't resonate with me. And when I found out these people who, Irenaeus is just a couple people, like, I think it's only like two people between him and Jesus in terms of hands being laid on. And he's telling a very different story. And so that's when I started beginning to see there's more to this than what I'd experienced in my particular parochial tradition. The church is larger than the testimony about Jesus is larger than I realized, and that there are many people in different places and different times and different cultures who spoke different languages, who had different assumptions about the world, who had all had this experience of, by the Spirit of the Father through this person, Jesus. And so I began to understand. He has this image that he uses where he talks about how to arrange the scriptures to see the king, and that the true teachers, those who are wise, arrange the scriptures in such a way that the image that is made is of a king, because they would make these mosaic floors in one part of the world and put a hypothesis on the back of it, a code or a key for which to reassemble it. And he says what some teachers do is they rearrange the scriptures and you end up with this image of a snake or an image of a fox or whatever, instead of the image of a king. And what I'm trying to get at is that I began to understand that I needed the pieces of the mosaic from my Pentecostal experience, but I also needed these Eastern Christians from the second, the third, and the fourth century, and the pieces of the mosaic that the Spirit had given them. And that I needed the whole church and all the people of God who have experienced our Lord through time in order to really see the full image of this human who's God. And so it's been a journey through those stages, and maybe I've taken too long to narrate that.
I really like that image. I have not heard that. I've heard. That's a beautiful illustration, how we take the mosaics, when you take the scriptures and then we build the mosaic with it. And, there's so many people that have a problem with the mosaic that they've been handed. The one that I grew up with is probably similar to yours with the rapture theology, left behind theology. And I never got the incarnation piece. That not even in my theology minor did I get the incarnation piece in my bachelor's degree. And this idea, they did tell me that God became human in Christ, but there was only one reason that God did that, and that was so that the substitutionary atonement on the cross worked. If he wasn't really human and if he didn't really die, then Jesus didn't really die for my sins. And that was the only piece of the incarnation that was ever handed to me in my entire theology minor in my bachelor's degree from an evangelical university. All of the ologies I took, that was the only thing ever said about the incarnation. And you're saying a whole lot more than that with the incarnation, that like this is a central tenet of the faith. And it's not just to hold up this dogma of substitutionary atonement per se, but you are saying, there's a lot going on, and you've delved into the tradition of the monastic mothers and fathers to find these beautiful pieces. How is their understanding of the incarnation different than this populist understanding that I kind of threw at you here? How are they different?
Yeah, I think there is a truth, that the Son becomes human in order to show us in the way that he dies as a human being what God is like. So, not that particular formulation that you gave, but that is at the heart of it, is that he comes and lives a kind of life toward dying and dies a kind of death that helps us to see that, the way that he comes among us in poverty and weakness and humility is not, because, like, for instance, becoming human is not a deprivation, right? We were made good in the image of God. And so God can't become what he hates. God can't become what is inherently evil. He becomes what he in the beginning makes very good. And yes, as Athanasius says, he sees us falling away from love. We've turned from love. We're falling away down in he says in the Contingentes, which is part of the work on the Incarnation. He says, God sees humanity falling down into the grave and beyond the grave to non-existence, from the non-existence from which we came, and he does not envy the world or humanity his permanence. He wants to share his permanence with all of us, and he takes flesh in order to make the world permanent, and part of that mercy, part of that humility, part of that descent is in doing that, he upends all of our projections, the Greeks and the Romans, and have projections of a God that are, fallen ideas from what we believe a God might be like. And when God shows up in the flesh of Jesus, he doesn't show up in a poor family and in weakness and in vulnerability in order to just assume that momentarily to be a servant to us. No, it's actually his humility, his poverty, his weakness that are revelations not only of what it means to be human, but what God is like in eternity. Take some of his words, like, for instance, his words to his disciples about being a servant. Because you guys are always arguing about, who's in charge. But I'm amongst you as one who serves. I'm amongst you as the servant. He doesn't just say that to like I'm the, I think it's because he was always just taking care of everyone, the waiter at the table or the porter, at the hotel. He was literally among them as one who served. He didn't make himself, great among them. And by doing all that, he was trying to show us what God is like, that God is the custodian of the cosmos and the universe. He exists, behind the scenes, like a good waiter, always just taking care of the world. And so he comes amongst us in all these ways to show us that God is really, that not only this is the way human beings were made in this image, and this is how we thrive, is by being vulnerable, by being humble, by being servants, but this is not like foreign to what God is. This is actually his whole life shows us what God's life is like in eternity. So that, I mean, we could talk about, many aspects of this, but it goes well beyond the formulation that you had used. Part of the mystery is that it is in his death that he shows us how to be human. Yeah. And it's all caught up in what it means also to be God. So that is different than the story.
Yeah.
That lots of folks are raised with. And I do think when we tell the story well, it resonates with people because they're made in that image.
Yeah.
And so they're made in the image of abundance, not scarcity, made in the image of humility, not pride, made in the image of generosity, not greed, made in the image of service, not, I don't know, what does Jesus say? Lording over, this is what we were made in that image, and this is what God is really like in eternity. And so when we began to ponder this human God, and we begin to ponder what it means to be God and what it means to be human based on this particular human being, instead of importing our ideas about what it might to be, our abstract ideas of what it might be to be a human and our abstract ideas of what it might be for a God to be a God. And we look at this human being, we start to talk about what it means to be human, what it means to be God based on this person's life and what his life reveals to us. We're going to be closer to that mystery that we were earlier.
Yeah. In kind of my earlier years in the faith, that whole humility piece, the humility of God, was treated as like an anomaly, an unfortunate necessity that God had to do in order to reclaim power on the other side. And then in the second coming is going to subdue all of his enemies in this grand war. And
there's trouble with that, obviously, because God doesn't change.
Right. But I love how you're saying this isn't an anomaly. This is God. God is like Christ.
It's really bad news. It's not good news. If the one who shows up at the end of the world is not the same one who descends into the hell of that woman lying naked in the dust, probably roughed up quite a bit by the crowd, who are ready to stone her for adultery. And he's just sitting there writing in the dirt, and he finally looks up and says, "He's without sin, throw the first stone." And from the older who have some experience, maybe a little more experience, usually sometimes it's young, sometimes it's old people who haven't grown up yet who want to kill, but they each realize that we got to drop these stones. And then he turns to her and says, go and sin no more. And by doing that, he's not just telling her, I don't like what you're doing, do something else, or I'm judging what you're doing. He's giving her the capacity not to go looking for love in the wrong place anymore. The one who opens the eyes of the blind, who kisses lepers, who causes the lame to walk, who sets prisoners free, is the same one who shows up at the end of time. It's not a different one, and if it's a different one, we're in trouble. We need the one. All of us, all humans, need the one who, joins us, in this plight. We are infected with death, and we need to be healed from that. We need to be made permanent. So it's we need the same one who is, who's come to defeat death, to trample down death by death, to show up at the end of the world, and that not just at the end of the world, but I need him to show up right now, and you need him to show up right now, and some people who are listening need him to show up right now, and he does, and bread and wine on the table, and altars all over the world. He shows up in the poor. He tells us he shows up in prisoners and the naked and the stranger, the refugee, and the one who doesn't have food. He's showing up all the time.
In my evangelical tradition that I came out of, it was very anti-Catholic, as well as it was very complementarian and patriarchal.
Yeah.
And we were taught a very low view of Mary. That she was just a vessel for this moment of the incarnation. And you have written about Mary's role in the incarnation, and you have a much higher view of her. Can you talk a little bit about Mary's role in the incarnation?
Where to start? there's a lot there. I mean,
I'm glad there's a lot there.
Yeah, she says yes. God invites Mary into providence. He invites Mary into this mission to redeem the cosmos, and she says yes. She gives her consent, and Mary, Jesus takes his humanity from Mary. By a mystery, the Spirit hovers over her, like it's an echo of Genesis 3, or Genesis 1, where the Spirit, over the face of the deep, the water, the Spirit hovers over the face of the deep, and a new creation begins to take shape, in her womb, and what's interesting about that is, people have a hard time with, the virginal conception of Jesus, but there is an absence in that moment of the male, of the human species, right? Mm-hmm. So it does kind of upend, a lot of these, systems, because a woman says yes, and by the power of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin, God takes flesh, and so therefore we call her Theotokos. We call her the God bearer, the mother of God, not in the sense that God didn't exist before Mary, but that we are proclaiming her unique vocation as the one who bears God into the world. The Son of God takes flesh from her, and it's not just the 9 months of bearing him. He who cannot be contained, as Solomon says, of God is contained, in her womb, and all of the preparation and the waiting and the difficulty of bearing a child, which you and I don't know except by watching, and the pain and all of these things, and then it's not over. I mean, there are things to do. He needs to be nourished. God has made himself vulnerable to the elements and to hunger and thirst, and he needs Joseph to protect him, and he needs Joseph pay attention to the angelic voices, and to so the family become refugees in Egypt, and he needs to be nursed. And then Mary is the one who teaches him to speak, the one who spoke all things into existence, the Son of the Father who speaks. He's the Word, becomes wordless. He becomes silent, in her womb, and then he learns to speak as all humans do by listening to his mother say words like Abba and Emma. She's the one who teaches him to pray, sing the Psalms, And in time, which she knew very well, I mean, our tradition says she's, and when I say our tradition, I mean the human tradition. I mean the tradition that belongs to all humans about who this person is. It's something I think we have to use these words, and we have to be clear that we're not saying, like, I'm saying all of our tradition. She was a seamstress in the temple, and so this is someone who, one of the most interesting things I think about the resurrection story is the way that John sees the way the clothes are folded, and knows that there's someone who folds clothes in that particular way. And he's the only person who folds clothes in that way. And I think he learned to fold clothes from his mother in that particular way, because she was very particular about fabrics. And he believes, because there's nobody who folds clothes like that. So that person must be alive in the world again. And the clothes that were on him are set aside and folded in a particular way. But she's the one who teaches him so many things. She teaches him to sing the Psalms of Israel, which, as we know, many of which are about his person, and somehow in a mystery, in time and praying and singing those songs, which were the songs of the whole people of God, who Mary and Joseph are singing, and he's praying with everyone else in the temple. In the mystery of humanity, real humanity, he comes to be, these songs are about me, and so there's so much to say about her, and what it means, that God has a mother. And he takes all that up into what it means to be, God, when he dies for the life of the world that he loves. God makes the world in love. God loves the world that he makes. God makes us in his image. We fall away from love. God becomes what he makes. That's something we can't do. We can't become what we make. God becomes what he makes, and becomes what he makes in order to rescue us from our descent into non-being, bring us back up into his permanence. But when he goes back up into the life of God for eternity as an embodied human, he has, Mary gave him that body. I mean, it's transfigured and transmuted in ways we don't understand. But I like to think of Jesus, maybe because of my doctor, rubbing his hands together in eternity, and they have the scars, of his suffering, and these are the hands that held the face of Mary, and he remembers what it was like to have a mother, and what it was like to fall and have her pick him up, and remembers what it was like to have her teach him, or the songs that she taught him to sing, and all of these things. Again, it's hard. You ask a question and I start, I just kind of, it's like, I just keep talking, and
I am listening, because I'm like watching you contemplate Jesus, and I'm just kind of like, I'm not going to interrupt. I just want to keep.
He's connected to her.
Yeah. And
because he's connected to her, he's connected to you and me. And he's connected to all of, she connects him to that whole history of humanity before, and to the whole history of humanity, even into the centuries beyond where we are right now. All the humans who have ever been and ever will be. He becomes one of us as we actually are in the world right now. He's not Superman. He's not an alien humanoid. If you cut him, he bleeds. If he walks several miles and he gets to the well, he's thirsty. He's traveling with a fisherman. He's asleep. It's not a special kind of humanity. He's as vulnerable to everything as we are. And including to death. So he takes upon he takes on human nature. What has not been assumed has not been redeemed. And so it's not a special kind of humanity that's different from the humanity of Adam and Eve, different from the humanity of Mary. It's the same humanity. It's not different from my humanity or your humanity.
I think our faith has to also be that. And so often we make our faith an otherworldly thing, and we have to be a very different kind of people than, walking around. And we kind of have now I see for what it is. It's self-righteousness. But what I used to think it was I need to be some kind of a religious human, not just a human, but a religious one. And then I have to, walk around with this air of religiousness and goodness and morality. And it was like I spent so many years trying to do this impersonation of who I think I ought to be instead of being the human that I am. And when I learned how to be the human that I am, with the faith that I have, it's like my faith makes sense to my life. And when I talk to, I've done 28 funerals for our community this year. And when I get up in front and I talk about what it's like to be human, what it's like to experience grief and loss and death, whether they're atheist, agnostic, Christian, or just not sure of anything, they all say that makes sense, and I don't have to say anything overtly religious. I just give them, here's how to be human in this situation, and I'll use whatever vocabulary they're comfortable with. But it's like I'm not trying to superimpose something from, some other planet onto this one and say, this is what it's like to be a Christian. You have to, do something so odd and weird. And it's like, no, you just really have to learn how to be a human being. And a good thing, our God became a human being to show us what it's like to be human.
Yeah, and even, like anger and sadness and anxiety and all of these things, Jesus was, but without violating his relationship with the Father and without walking away from love. He was, in other words, these things that we just call, well, that's he's being human. He was angry in a way that was not divorced from the character of God. He was sad in a way, and even in the garden, he is anxious as he ponders his coming death, and all of those things participated in God's goodness. And so we can be human, anxious and angry and sad, and and sometimes I think again, certainly in some of the places that I was raised, you can't be any of those things. You have to always only have courage, and always only be positive, and always hold your peace, and so there are ways. Jesus shows us that there are ways to have all the range of human emotion, and and all the range of being human, and that not be a violation of what it means to be human.
Yeah, I still have a hard time not just expressing, but even experiencing my own, what I would have considered negative emotions. Now I just know that they are emotions. And I still have a hard time showing hospitality to my anger and showing hospitality to anxiousness. I will acknowledge that I have it now, but it's still, it is still hard.
It's a thin line for us, between
I'm afraid of it, really.
Any of these things, and particularly anger,
Yeah,
and
it's scary.
and getting into violation of what it might be to be centered,
Yeah,
in doing that is very complicated.
it is.
And yet, this one shows us as human and as God, right? How one can experience his range of emotion and uh, not be violent to love,
Mm,
And so, yeah, it's a great. I mean, I guess there's so many things to ponder when we really start to think and experience what it means that God becomes human. Um, I don't think I mean, one of the greatest gifts that I think there is to this is the sacred year, which belongs to all humans, sort of ordering our life to the time of God with us and Jesus's life among us as a human. And that cycle, that's annual and repeats from Advent to Pentecost into ordinary time, takes us through things like Christmas and Epiphany and Lent and Holy Week and Easter and all these things. I see things I hadn't seen before. I mean, every time, because it's infinite. We're talking about something that's infinite, and we're finite. But it just gives me great joy because there's no plumbing there's no fathoming it.
yeah.
You just see new things, all the time. And it's so much more than this. It's a reduction. It's a poverty to say it the way that we were taught, which is he does this just so he has a body to be slain, is, is a massive reduction of the mystery. And no wonder that doesn't hold up, and that people start to question that. And particularly when it's wedded to, that this is something the Father is doing, to the Son, or, so it's like so many things. It's part of the story, but it's been in the sense that God becomes human to die, and that death is what brings permanence to the cosmos and shows us the nature of God and shows us what it means to be human. We can also become permanent by dying with God for the life of the world and so forth. But it twists it in a way that keeps us from seeing this massive beauty.
Mm-hmm. I had an idea. Like, I think that twisting and reduction of the incarnation is then used it's almost like a justifier for our violence and our love of power and our authoritarianisms. Yeah. Because this is what God is like, so I now exercise my right.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
It 100% does. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it,
Yeah.
And what we believe or trust about God ends up underwriting, what we do as human beings, or what we allow as human beings, or what we welcome, And there are things that we allow and welcome and do that have, they cannot participate in love, and they cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And so, especially when we write or read, our fallenness back into God, it's going to have real world consequence for the world. Just like, but for one example of what you and I were both raised with, this idea that the world will in the end be destroyed. If you believe that, it's going to make you less interested in its conservation, less interested in being, a cultivator of the world. As people like Wendell Berry, have just been so helpful to us in understanding our connection to the world, the world's connection to us, and that we exist in symbiosis with it, and that we need to, we're caretakers of the world. We're invited into that from the beginning. That's our role, and in the end, it's our role, because all these weapons that have distracted us become once again, farming tools. And when Jesus is resurrected from the dead, she mistakes him for the gardener, not because, he's got a gardening outfit on, but I think because he's down in the dirt planting something, and he's getting back to the location of what it is to be human. He's cultivating something, and she walks up and, hey, have you seen, where Jesus is? Well, Jesus has gotten back to the human vocation, which is to take care of the world and preserve the world. And then he, of course, he's gonna respond to her, and she hears her name, and she becomes this woman becomes the first witness of the resurrection to everyone. That's a different story than the story of. It's almost comical, and it is, and they do make comics, and they do make movies, of the end of the world. It's that's not the story, but that's the story that people make of it once you believe that the world is inherently evil and that God has to destroy it, instead of, as is very clearly stated in Scripture, all made good by God. And I get it. There's passages in First Peter, that talk about the heavens, and melting and all these kinds of things. But you and I are new creations, and we're not. God doesn't destroy us in order to make us new creations, and He won't destroy the world also to bring about a new creation. It's language that is saying, like, the redemption is cosmic. Yeah. Everything will be affected by the goodness of God being revealed. The moon and the sun and the stars and the whole thing is going to be renovated.
I love that.
So
I just want to know, you have a book coming out soon. Is that something that you're ready to tell us a bit about?
I've been talking about it for years. I've been working on it for years, and we're really, I just saw the cover on Friday.
You shared it. It's beautiful.
And I'm just shocked. I mean, we're going, like, we're in this, like, these processes that are very final, and it's like, there's a lot of humility in that too. I at times in the process, especially as it's become, like, as real as it become, you think, why did I ever think I should do this? Yeah. And then, there's this, your witness today, for instance, tells me, well, there's a reason, that I'm doing this, because it's helping, it's helping Tom, it's helping other people. But I suppose, like, if you're going to write about the humility of God, there's got to be some humility in the process, I suppose. And I feel like the closer it gets to being an actuality, I feel a great deal of, like, I don't know, like a hesitancy or something, or whatever. But I suppose there's no way to do a project like this without having that experience. And but yeah, it's you weren't asking a philosophical question. It is coming out, in October of 2024,
All right.
Lord willing. And we'll be doing what they call production edits in the new year, which is all the kind of fine tuning that happens with the text. And then, I'm sure what they call advanced reader copies will start going out to people like you, who interview people and
I'd love that. I'd love to have you back on when it's right
and
on the cusp of coming out.
I would guess like in the early summer or late spring or something. I don't know how it works, but
right.
The book comes out in October
of
2022, God willing. So,
well, I will definitely put you on the schedule for next year, because this has been a wonderful conversation, and I just thank you for contemplating the person of Christ in my presence. I was just I was going to ask you, what does that look like? And then you just showed me what it looked like with this conversation. So I was really pleased.
All of that. I mean, we just take it, the sacred year was very important in the structure of it. And we just kind of take you through, the life of Jesus and talk about how these various moments that the sacred year elevates from Jesus's life,
mm-hmm.
and that we celebrate and ponder as the year goes through. We just that became the show. I mean, it was just like, oh yeah, that's it. That's the structure, and it kind of fell in place after that. And,
I'm on my fourth year of observing the liturgical cycle. I'm on my fourth year.
So. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't, like, it's not articulated that way, but anyone who does, who practices, the faith using the sacred year will immediately see, that's the structure. Because
mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that just, all sorts of kind of people will, pick it up and read it and start hearing the story that, gives me life, and I'm hoping that they'll become astonished by Jesus through the stories and the images and the writing.
Well, I am astonished today. So
good times, Tom. Thanks for having me on. And
yes, and yes, I'll definitely schedule some time when your book is closer, and we'll talk more specifically about that. And just, thank you for your voice. Thank you for your writings. Thank you for doing what you do. You're blessing the world.
Okay. Bless you.
Well, thank you so much for listening to the Liminal Living podcast. This has been a fun conversation. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope you stay tuned in. We have some more wonderful conversations in store for you. Next week, we have Dr. Chris Green will be with us, and I have got some more fun interviews that are on the docket that are going to close this year out and start season 3 in January. I've already got 6 episodes planned out, and it's going to be a good year, and it's been a fun ride. So we will see you next week. Peace.